Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the organization to invite me, and good evening, everyone. What I will like to do here is to present some information or some research that we have been doing with a couple of people within the OECD at industrial robotics and the effects and the implications on the global organization of production, but also broader on the speed and the direction of globalization more in general. So just to say to focus on what we're talking about, we are really talking about on industrial robotics. We are using data coming from the International Federation of Robotics. I'm not gonna announce the definition of these industrial robotics, but basically it's industrial robotics installed, implemented, and used within manufacturing industries. Now, if you're seeing a bit over time, you see that the number of robotics, because we have only information that's already directly one caveat of this work, we have only information on the number of robotics, of the number of robots that are installed within these manufacturing industries, across industries and across countries. We don't have real information about the quality because we don't have information about the value of these robots. So that's definitely already one limitation of this work. Now, if you're seeing over time, you see that this number of robots in manufacturing industries that are installed and used there is increasing very sharply. For most countries, this is increasing very strongly developed economies, but also recently you see a very high investment, very large investment in robotics, also in emerging economies. Here are data, these are the 10 largest investors in robotics. China and Thailand, for example, are among those 10. The top line is Japan, which shows, of course, the high incidence of investments of robots in Japan already since a long time, but there is also some definitional issue that explains the rather constant line for Japan. Now then, if you're looking at these robots in these manufacturing industries, basically they're concentrated in a rather limited number of industries. The yellow bars are ICT, electronics, computers, not that surprising. The blue bars are the automotive industry especially, and the gray bars are the metals and the machinery industry. And basically across all countries at the global level, 3/4 of the number of robots are used within those three industries. This is a constant across the different countries. Now, so that's the one thing that we're looking at, the effect of these industrial robotics at the one side, and how is this going to affect the location of production across the globe. And just bear with me, I just trying to very simply give you an overview of how this location of production has changed over the years. And yes, so we're starting from I've taken here a company within France, given that the OECD is based in Paris, where basically, and here we're talking about the 60s, where all the activities, distribution, production, and R&D are located within in the same location within France. What happens then, and I hope the slides work, is that in the first phase, companies started to offshore especially distribution activities and sales activities in order to target other markets. Especially later also production activities, and especially to countries close by the headquarters. So European multinationals were expanding especially in Europe, and then in later phases they also went to the United States, South America, and of course more recent, and then we're talking about the last 10 to 15 years, you saw a lot of offshoring of production activities to countries like China, to countries like more recently Vietnam, Indonesia. Why? Because the low labor costs there and these labor-intensive activities were offshore to these countries. More recently, you also saw that R&D activities have been relocated to other countries. So that's basically This location, this growing location, international location of production, has then given rise to what we call global value chains. A value chain is basically, in economic terms, you can quickly think about it from you have the end product or the end service, but let's talk here about the end product, and then all the different activities that are needed in order to produce that end product. Starting with R&D, design, then the inputs, the components, the raw materials, the assembly, etc. So you really see that that value chains that was first located, and I'm talking about 50s, 60s, was located in one location, has become increasingly located across different countries. And really these have become global value chains. And the result is that products are increasingly made in the world within these global value chains because these different, the subsequent activities in the production processes have become located, have become dispersed internationally. And it's basically about all products. It's going from very basic or low technology intensive products, like for example t-shirts, like the Barbie doll. They're also to very advanced, very high knowledge technology intensive products like an airplane, like a car, and probably some of you have already heard about the iPhone, how this production process has become spread out over different countries, and then how much it contributes to the value, to the GDP within these different countries. So you really see that these products are increasingly made in the world. And just as a side step, the fact that these global value chains have become so important, international trade statistics and international trade rules have basically not adapted to this changed reality. For example, international trade statistics really overestimating exports and imports at the global level. Why? Because a lot of the value add that is created in one country is exported then to another country within this value chain, included, for example, in the assembly, and is then exported again. So there is a lot of double counting, triple counting, multiple counting, and basically international trade statistics haven't taken this into account. And that's also one of the reasons why the World Trade Organization for the moment is in such major problems and difficulties, because they haven't taken into account this changed trade reality across industries and across countries. A very important point. Now, how can robots and robotics, how can they really affect this location of production, these global value chains? Well, basically there are two channels. At the one side, robots can decrease or will decrease the cost of production. And then we're thinking especially in terms of labor cost, which is important because you saw that there has been the last 10 to 15 years, you have seen that there is a lot of offshoring of these labor-intensive activities from developed, let's say OECD economies, to less developed, to emerging economies, China, Indonesia, etc., etc. So, of course, if you're able to automate, if you're able to use much more robotics, the labor cost or the labor share in your total cost of production will become much less important. So for developed economies, this is a very important point because the cost of production can go down, especially as we know that the cost of robotics is decreasing very significantly and very sharply, while at the same time the quality of these robots are increasing. For the moment, the majority of robots in manufacturing industries are used rather for repetitive industries, for repetitive activities, and also well-defined. But of course, with artificial intelligence, you will see that the functionality of these robots, and we have talked about this morning, that these robotics will be able to do many more activities, much more complex activities. So at the one side, you see that the cost is going down, and at the other side, that the functionality is going up. So really, the economic case for implementing more robotics is pretty clear in the case of developed economies. And the other second channel why robotics may affect the location of production, is that these global value chains have become so long and so complex that it has reached its boundaries. For a company, if really, I will give you the example of Adidas, and I will come back later to that. Adidas, to get its footwear, its sports shoes on the market, it needs 18 weeks because it has really located its international production so quickly. And so you can imagine that if at a certain moment Adidas is a bit too late to pick up the changes in tastes and the changes in consumer behavior, basically it takes 4 or 5 months in order that it can have new shoes on the market. So there is really these global value chains have reached its boundaries. And so in order really to be closer to the market, companies are rethinking, are reshaping these strategies of international sourcing. So that are the two main channels through which robots can affect the location. So while before offshoring was the fashionable word, and offshoring was especially fashionable with companies. And you saw that especially in the US, there was a lot of Me Too behavior where one company said, oh, my competitor 10 kilometers away has offshored his activities or part of his activities to China. I have to do the same because otherwise I will lose my clients, I will have to higher prices. So you saw that this offshoring was very fashionable in the strategies of companies. Now you see that, another word, reshoring, bringing back the activities, backshoring is another word, has become very fashionable. Not that much, not yet, with companies, because the evidence on these reshoring activities is for the moment not that much important. It's especially with governments, because they see the potential about that. For example, again in the US, you see that the government is really trying to push this manufacturing renaissance and this reshoring, trying to get the companies, the US companies that had offshored activities before, trying to get these activities back to the US. I gave already the example of Adidas. Another example is Philips, which has basically brought 50%, 55% of its production of electric shavers, has brought it back from China to the north of Holland. And there they have a large manufacturing plant with not much employment, not much jobs involved, and the jobs that are involved, because the whole production is robotized, is automated, and the jobs that are involved are already highly skilled. And I will come back to that later too. So what we did is really trying to see a bit what are these effects of robotics on, off, and reshoring. And I'm not going to talk really about the analysis. Let me just allude to the most important results. We are able to establish a very negative effect of more robots, and again in units, on offshoring. So you will see that industries in countries that implement more robots, that there the offshoring is going downwards. So you will really see that robots can keep production basically at home. That's the first important thing. That's the first important observation. The evidence is a bit weaker for reshoring, and the big reason is there that we don't have that many cases of reshoring, not yet. So we don't find a lot of evidence for the fact that robots can basically bring back activities home. We did also some specific analysis for how multinational enterprises are spreading their productive resources, and productive resources then especially capital and employment. And also there we see a positive effect of robotics in the sense that multinationals really concentrating their activities more and more in countries where there is a high investment in robotics. So you really see that there is something happening. Let me directly also say that more analysis is needed. One, as I said already before, we have only information on the units of robotics. We don't have real information about the quality, about the value of robotics. But secondly, also, it's a recent phenomenon. The first slide, the first graph that I showed you there, you really see that it's only the last 5, 6 years that this investment in robotics in industrial applications, I mean, is really taking up. So what we're planning to do is really to look further into this and really to follow this further up. So then the big question is, of course, what about globalization? Will it be business as usual, as we see, with more trade, more investment, more longer global value chains, etc., or will there be a new normal? And if you're looking, here are the data, I think, from 2000, basically what you see is the business as usual scenario is that happened until 2007, 2008 with the financial and economic crisis, where you saw GDP, international trade, and international investment really increasing very strongly. Now again, international trade, as I said, there is an exaggeration in the sense that there is a lot of multiple counting in these international trade statistics. 2008, 2009, the big financial economic crisis, of course, international trade and FDI collapsed, but pretty quickly afterwards, you saw it increasing again. 2010, 2011, it increased again. But then basically, since 2013, you really see that it's not moving very fast anymore. It's stabilizing a bit. And the question is then, what is the reason here? Is it that on one side, uncertainties, which are typically playing on the short term, and there are a lot of uncertainties. The discussions, well, the trade wars, trade discussions between US and China, between US and EU, between EU and China are, to say not the least, are not going very good for the moment. So definitely the uncertainties are very important. But at the other side, it could be also that there are structural shifts at the horizon. And digitalization is one of these structural shifts. And that's what we found in another study is really, and basically in this one study, we were asking the question from, okay, how will the global economy, how will this international trade, how will this international investment look alike in 10 to 15 years from now? And we developed some scenarios depending on different factors. And basically what came out of there is digitalization is the most important game changer and would really dampen the speed and the direction of economic globalization. And at one side, you have communication technologies, the C in ICT, what we always calling, and that is really pushing globalization further in the sense that it allows companies to spread out its activities very internationally because they can communicate and monitor their activities. At the other side, you have information technologies. Robotics is one of them, but there are, of course, others. 3D printing, there is a lot of talk about 3D printing, the industry 4.0, big data, cloud computing, et cetera, et cetera. So these are really basically changing the speed and the direction of globalization. That's at least what we found in these simulation exercises. And so these are new challenges for developed. Developed economies are heavily betting on these digital, on robotics, on 3D printing industry 4.0. That's why governments are putting so much money in there, because they see this as the reindustrialization of their economies. But at the other side, it are also important challenges for developing economies. Because if you're looking China, if you're looking other countries, for example, Mexico, we saw that robotics are very important in the automotive industry. Now, Mexico, one of the drivers or the motors behind its industrialization has become really the automotive industry by US companies that have planted their activities in the maquiladoras just across the border, the US, Mexico. Now, of course, if these robotics are becoming more and more important, if the costs go down, if the functionality increases, this is basically challenging the whole economic development model of these emerging economies. And that's also one of the reasons that a country like China, that a country like Thailand is investing so heavily within these robots because they know that they can't continue to do what they have been doing until now. So another point that we are finding is that there is really a rebalancing of the world economy with the center, the economic center, pushing a big back to OECD economies, and that maybe that instead of talking about globalization, we have to start to talk more about regionalization around regional blocks. Thank you. I have included also a slide with some of the information with the different studies for the people that are more interested in reading more. Thank you.
Because they begin with a law, which is to keep the clear distinction between a living being and a machine. They push this in direction, and there's another point, I think, in the law in California. So we have to take care to look at that too, and maybe to adopt largely this kind of thing.
Well, thank you. I was wondering whether Joachim has a reaction to these reactions to his extrapolation issue, or not, anyway.
Let's do that over coffee.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. We deserve the coffee break. See you later.